It was a calm morning along the riverbank, the kind where everything seems untouched by the chaos of the world. Michael Bennett, a man who valued the stillness of nature, was enjoying his daily walk when a sound shattered the tranquility. A faint cry, sharp, desperate, caught his attention. He froze, his eyes scanning the water. There it was, a tiny German shepherd puppy battling against the relentless current, its tiny paws thrashing helplessly. Without hesitation, Michael dove into the icy water, driven by instinct to save it. What he didn't know was that this single moment would change everything. Stay with us to witness a story of courage, connection, and a bond that will leave you in tears. Michael Bennett had always found peace along the riverbank. The sound of the flowing water, the rustling leaves in the trees, and the soft chirping of birds created a sanctuary away from the chaos of daily life. His morning walks had become a ritual, a chance to reflect and recharge. This morning, the river seemed particularly calm. The sunlight danced on the surface, and the cool breeze carried the scent of damp earth. But just as Michael rounded a familiar bend in the path, a sharp cry cut through the air, freezing him in his tracks. It was faint at first, barely audible over the murmur of the river. But there it was again, higher, more desperate. Michael scanned the water, his heart pounding. At first, he saw nothing. Then, as his eyes adjusted to the glare of the sunlight on the water, he spotted it. A small figure, dark against the current, was struggling to stay afloat. A German shepherd puppy, no bigger than a loaf of bread, was being swept downstream. Michael's breath caught. Without thinking, he dropped his jacket and boots on the ground and sprinted toward the river's edge. The water was colder than he'd expected, a biting chill that took his breath away, but he didn't stop. "Hold on!" he shouted, though the puppy likely couldn't hear him over the roar of the current. The icy water made his limbs heavy, but Michael pushed forward, his arms cutting through the current with every ounce of strength he had. The puppy's head bobbed under the surface, disappearing for agonizing seconds before reappearing, gasping for air. When he finally reached the struggling animal, Michael extended his arm, his fingers brushing against soaked fur. With a firm grip, he pulled the tiny body to his chest. The puppy let out a weak whimper, its small frame trembling violently against him. "It's okay," Michael murmured, his voice shaky. "I've got you." The swim back to shore was even harder. The weight of the wet puppy and the relentless current tested his strength, but adrenaline pushed him forward. When he finally reached the riverbank, he collapsed onto the grass, gasping for air. The puppy was limp in his arms, its small chest heaving as it fought to breathe. Michael quickly wrapped it in his jacket, rubbing its fur to generate warmth. "You're safe now," he whispered, his own breath still uneven. The puppy's eyes fluttered open, meeting Michael's gaze. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Michael felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility and connection. He stood, cradling the fragile life close to his chest. As he walked back to his truck, questions swirled in his mind. Where had the puppy come from? How had it ended up in the river? But one thing was certain. This little dog needed him, and in ways he couldn't yet understand, he needed it too. Michael's truck bounced along the gravel road as he kept glancing at the small, shivering bundle on the passenger seat. The German shepherd puppy lay motionless, wrapped tightly in his jacket, its tiny body trembling from the ordeal. "Just hang in there, little guy," Michael said softly, his hands gripping the steering wheel. His voice was calm, but his mind raced. He wasn't sure how close the pup was to succumbing to the cold or the water it had swallowed. When he reached his home, a modest cabin tucked into the woods, Michael quickly carried the puppy inside. The warmth of the room enveloped them both as he set the pup on the couch. He grabbed a towel and began drying its fur, taking care not to agitate the frightened animal. The puppy let out a small whimper but didn't resist. Its breathing was shallow, its tiny chest rising and falling unevenly. Michael reached for an old blanket, wrapping the dog snugly and placing it near the fireplace. "You're safe now," he murmured, sitting on the floor beside the pup. For a moment, he watched the firelight flicker in its amber eyes, which now looked at him with a mix of exhaustion and trust. Michael grabbed his phone and dialed the local vet, Dr. Hansen. "Bring him in right away," Dr. Hansen instructed after Michael described the situation. Within minutes, Michael was back in his truck, the puppy nestled securely in his lap. He spoke softly as he drove, his words an odd comfort even to himself. You're going to be okay. I promise. At the clinic, Dr. Hansen greeted him with a concerned expression. The elderly vet, a kind man who had treated animals in the area for decades, quickly examined the puppy. He's malnourished and exhausted, but no broken bones, Dr. Hansen said, running his hands gently over the pup's frail body. We'll give him fluids and monitor him for the next few hours. You did the right thing bringing him here so quickly. Michael let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Will he make it? Dr. Hansen smiled reassuringly. He's a fighter. With the right care, he should recover just fine. Michael stayed at the clinic, sitting on the bench outside the exam room. He couldn't bring himself to leave the puppy's side. Something about the little dog's struggle felt deeply personal, though he couldn't explain why. When Dr. Hansen finally emerged with the puppy cradled in his arms, Michael stood immediately. He's stable now, the vet said, but he'll need plenty of rest, proper nutrition, and a lot of care over the next few weeks. I'll take care of him, Michael said without hesitation. Dr. Hansen handed him a small bag of supplies. Here's what you'll need to get started, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to call. Back at home, Michael set up a small bed for the puppy in the corner of the living room, close to the fireplace. The dog stirred weakly, its eyes following him as he moved around the room. You need a name, Michael said, crouching beside the bed. He thought for a moment, taking in the pup's dark, wet fur and the fierce determination it had shown in the water. How about Storm? The puppy's ears twitched slightly, and Michael chuckled. Storm it is. Over the next few days, Storm began to regain his strength. At first, he barely moved, his small body still weak from the ordeal. But Michael was patient, feeding him small meals, cleaning his fur, and talking to him as though he were an old friend. One evening, as Michael sat reading by the fire, he felt a soft nudge against his leg. He looked down to see Storm standing shakily, his eyes brighter than they had been before. Hey, buddy, Michael said, a smile spreading across his face. You're getting stronger, aren't you? Storm wagged his tail weakly, and Michael felt a swell of pride and relief. For the first time in years, his cabin felt alive, not just with the sound of the fire or the wind outside, but with the presence of a life he'd saved. The days that followed felt like a slow but steady rhythm of healing. For both Michael and Storm, life seemed to settle into a routine. Each day, Storm grew stronger, and Michael found himself increasingly invested in the little pup's recovery. Storm, once weak and barely able to move, now followed Michael around the cabin with hesitant steps. His limp was still noticeable, and he often paused to rest, but the determination in his amber eyes was unmistakable. You've got spirit, Storm, Michael said one morning as the pup struggled to climb onto the couch. Storm wagged his tail, almost as if he understood the compliment. Outside, autumn had deepened. The trees were ablaze with fiery reds and golden yellows, their leaves carpeting the ground. Michael decided it was time to introduce Storm to the world beyond the cabin. Bundling up in his jacket, Michael opened the front door. Storm hesitated at first, sniffing the cool air, his paws tentatively stepping onto the porch. Come on, buddy, Michael encouraged, walking ahead. Storm followed, his nose glued to the ground as he explored this new territory. For a while, they walked in silence. The crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant calls of birds filled the air. Storm paused often, curious about every fallen branch and rustling bush. As they neared the river, Michael's thoughts drifted back to the day he'd found Storm. The memory of the pup's fragile body and desperate struggle against the current still lingered in his mind. He glanced down at Storm, who was now happily sniffing a patch of wildflowers. You've come a long way, Michael murmured. Back at the cabin, Michael began noticing changes in himself as well. He had always lived a solitary life, content with the quiet and simplicity of his days. But with Storm around, the silence no longer felt so heavy. Storm had a way of filling the space with his small but determined presence. Whether it was the sound of his paws padding across the wooden floor or the way he rested his head on Michael's lap during quiet evenings, Storm had brought a sense of companionship that Michael hadn't realized he was missing. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Storm let out a small bark. It was the first sound of its kind Michael had heard from him. What is it, boy? Michael asked, Looking at the pup, Storm wagged his tail and barked again, this time more confidently. Michael laughed, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. You're finding your voice, huh? Storm's progress felt like a reflection of something inside Michael. As the puppy grew stronger and more playful, Michael found himself opening up in ways he hadn't before. But not everything was easy. One afternoon, Michael decided to test Storm's limits by taking him on a longer walk along the river. At first, Storm seemed excited, trotting ahead with his tail wagging. But halfway through, he stopped abruptly, his body stiffening. What's wrong? Michael asked, kneeling beside him. Storm's ears were pinned back, and his eyes darted toward the river. Michael followed his gaze. The current was faster today, the water rushing over rocks with a loud, relentless force. It was as though Storm remembered his ordeal, the fear etched into his small frame. It's okay, Michael said gently, placing a hand on Storm's back. You're safe now. Storm let out a low whimper, but he didn't move. Michael decided not to push him. Let's head back, he said, turning toward the cabin. Storm followed, staying close to his side. Back home, Michael watched Storm curl up by the fire, his breathing steady but his eyes distant. It was a reminder that some scars take time to heal. You're stronger than you think, Michael whispered, more to himself than to Storm. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy for either of them, but if there was one thing he'd learned from the little dog, it was that resilience often comes in the smallest, most unassuming forms. The days turned into weeks, and while Storm had grown visibly stronger, Michael noticed that certain moments still triggered an undeniable fear in the young pup. The river, in particular, seemed to haunt him. Each time they neared it, Storm would freeze, his ears flattening and his body trembling. Michael understood. He'd seen that kind of fear before, not in dogs, but in people. It was the same look his late brother had carried after returning from his final military tour. Trauma, Michael knew, didn't simply disappear with time. It lingered, surfacing in the quiet moments or when memories clawed their way back. But Michael was determined to help Storm heal. One chilly morning, Michael decided to try something new. Instead of walking along the riverbank, he took Storm to a nearby meadow. The field was expansive, bordered by tall trees and dotted with wildflowers. The openness seemed to put the puppy at ease. Go on, Michael encouraged, tossing a stick a few feet away. Storm hesitated for a moment before trotting after it. He picked it up awkwardly, his small jaws struggling to grip the branch. Michael laughed softly, clapping his hands. Good boy. The sound of Michael's approval lit a spark in Storm. He dropped the stick and sprinted back, tail wagging furiously. For the first time, Michael saw a carefree joy in the pup that had been missing since the day he'd rescued him. As the weeks passed, Storm's confidence grew. He no longer hesitated to explore, sniffing bushes and chasing after falling leaves. Yet, despite his progress, Michael noticed that Storm avoided the river entirely. One crisp afternoon, Michael decided it was time to face the fear head-on. He filled his backpack with essentials, a blanket, treats, and Storm's favorite toy, and led the pup toward the water. When they arrived, Storm immediately stopped, his tail tucked between his legs, and he let out a low whimper. Michael crouched beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his back. It's okay, buddy, he said softly. We're just going to sit here. No pressure. He laid out the blanket a safe distance from the water and sat down, patting the spot beside him. Storm hesitated but eventually curled up beside Michael, his eyes fixed on the rushing current. For a while, they sat in silence. Michael spoke gently, recounting stories from his own life, as if the pup could understand. You know, he began. When I was younger, I used to be scared of water too. Fell out of a boat once. Took me years to feel comfortable swimming again. Storm's ears twitched at the sound of Michael's voice. Fear's a tricky thing, Michael continued, but you don't have to face it alone. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the river, Michael stood and walked closer to the water's edge. He crouched down, letting his hands skim the surface. See? It's not so bad. Storm stayed rooted to the blanket, his body tense. But then, to Michael's surprise, the pup stood and took a tentative step forward. The moment felt fragile, as though any sudden movement might break Storm's resolve. Michael held his breath, watching as the young dog inched closer to the water. When Storm reached the edge, he sniffed cautiously, his nose brushing against the wet stones. He let out a soft whine, but didn't back away. "You're doing great," Michael said, his voice steady and encouraging. Storm looked back at him, and for the first time, there was a flicker of determination in his eyes. He dipped a paw into the shallow water, flinching at the cold, but keeping it there. Michael smiled, his chest swelling with pride. It wasn't a leap, but it was a step, a small, courageous step toward healing. As they walked back home that evening, Storm stayed close to Michael's side, his tail wagging slightly. For Michael, it was more than progress. It was a reminder that even the smallest victories could carry profound meaning. Winter had settled over the small town, blanketing the woods and meadows in frost. The crisp air carried a stillness, broken only by the crunch of snow underfoot. Storm, now a confident and playful companion, loved the snow. He bounded through drifts with infectious energy, his dark coat contrasting sharply against the white. Michael smiled as he watched Storm chase after a snowball he'd thrown, the pup barking joyfully as it vanished into the powder. It was hard to believe that just months ago, this same dog had been a frail, terrified creature, clinging to life. But their bond had grown stronger with every shared moment. Storm had become more than a pet. He was Michael's family, and that bond would soon face its greatest test. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a fiery glow over the snow-covered landscape, Michael decided to take Storm for a walk along a forest trail. The air was sharp but refreshing, and the quiet of the woods was comforting. As they walked, Storm trotted ahead, his tail wagging as he explored the underbrush. Michael called out, "Don't go too far, buddy." Storm stopped, turning back with a bark as if to say, "I won't." The peace of the moment was shattered by a sudden, sharp noise, a low growl, followed by rustling in the bushes. Michael froze, his heart racing. Storm's ears perked up, and he let out a deep, guttural bark, unlike any Michael had heard before. From the shadows emerged a coyote, its eyes gleaming and body tense. It was lean, its fur matted from the harsh winter. The animal growled, baring its teeth as it took a cautious step forward. "Storm, stay back," Michael commanded, his voice firm, but Storm didn't move. The pup stood his ground, his body low and his teeth bared, a fierce determination radiating from him. Michael could see the coyote hesitate, its eyes darting between Storm and the man behind him. The standoff felt like an eternity. Michael's mind raced, searching for a way to defuse the situation without endangering Storm. He grabbed a large branch from the ground and waved it, shouting, "Get out of here!" The coyote growled again, but took a step back, its confidence wavering under Michael's loud voice and Storm's unrelenting stance. Finally, with a reluctant snarl, it turned and disappeared into the shadows. Storm remained frozen, his eyes locked on where the coyote had been. Michael crouched beside him, placing a hand on his back. "It's okay, Storm. It's gone." Storm let out a low whine and turned to nuzzle against Michael's chest, his body trembling slightly. Michael held him close, his heart pounding. "You were so brave, buddy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Back at the cabin, Michael couldn't stop replaying the encounter in his mind. He'd always known Storm was loyal, but tonight had proven the depth of that loyalty. Storm hadn't just been protecting himself, he'd been protecting Michael. As they sat by the fire, Michael watched Storm, now curled up on his favorite blanket. "You saved me out there," he said softly. "You didn't have to, but you did." Storm's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and he lifted his head, his amber eyes meeting Michael's. In that moment, Michael felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude and love for the dog who had not only survived, but thrived and become a part of his life. Storm let out a contented sigh and rested his head on Michael's knee, his tail wagging lazily. Michael chuckled, stroking the dog's soft fur. "I guess we're even now," he said, smiling. That night, as Michael lay in bed, he found himself thinking about how much Storm had changed his life. The dog had brought him purpose, companionship, and a reminder that even in the face of fear and pain, resilience could lead to something beautiful. And as the wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the cabin, Michael knew one thing for certain. He and Storm were no longer just man and dog. They were a team, bonded by trust, courage, and a love that had been forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. The bond between Michael and Storm had become unshakable. Winter's grip on the town began to loosen, and the first signs of spring painted the landscape with hues of green and gold. With each passing day, Storm's confidence and strength grew, mirroring the changes in Michael himself. One morning, as the sun filtered through the trees, Michael decided to visit the local park, a sprawling area where Storm could roam freely and play. It would be a good test of the pup's progress, a chance to let him explore new surroundings and interact with other dogs. The park was alive with activity. Children laughed as they ran across the fields. Couples strolled hand in hand, and dogs of all breeds chased after frisbees and balls. Storm stuck close to Michael at first, his ears flicking at every unfamiliar sound. "Go on, buddy," Michael encouraged, kneeling beside him. He tossed a ball a short distance away, watching as Storm hesitated, then took off after it. His tail wagged furiously as he returned, dropping the ball at Michael's feet. "That's my boy," Michael said with a grin, tossing the ball again, this time further. Storm sprinted after it, his joy evident in every bounding step. As the morning went on, Storm began to relax, venturing further and even interacting with a few friendly dogs. Michael watched from a bench, pride swelling in his chest. Storm was no longer the scared, fragile pup he'd pulled from the river. He was thriving. But just as Michael was beginning to think of how far they'd come, a sudden commotion broke out near the playground. Shouts of alarm echoed across the park, and Michael's head snapped toward the sound. A young boy, no older than 6, was clutching a frisbee near the edge of a shallow pond. Without warning, the boy slipped, falling into the cold water. Michael shot to his feet, his heart racing. The boy's mother screamed, running toward the water, but she was too far away. The boy flailed, his small body sinking lower. Before Michael could react, Storm bolted past him. "Storm, no!" Michael shouted. But the dog didn't hesitate. Storm reached the water's edge in seconds, leaping in with a splash. The boy was gasping, his arms thrashing as Storm swam toward him. The dog grabbed the boy's jacket in his teeth, pulling him toward the shore with powerful strokes. By the time Michael reached them, Storm had dragged the boy onto the bank. The child coughed and sputtered, his wide eyes brimming with tears. Michael scooped him up, wrapping him in his own jacket as the boy's mother arrived, sobbing with relief. "Thank you," she cried, clutching her son tightly. "Thank you so much." Michael glanced down at Storm, who was soaked and shivering but wagging his tail. He crouched beside him, his voice thick with emotion. "You're a hero, Storm, an absolute hero." Back at the cabin that evening, Michael couldn't stop replaying the day's events. He sat by the fire, watching Storm nap on his blanket, his body rising and falling in steady breaths. "You've come full circle, haven't you?" Michael said softly. "From being saved to saving someone else." Storm stirred, opening one eye as if to acknowledge Michael's words. The incident at the park had solidified something Michael had long suspected. Storm wasn't just a survivor. He was a protector. Despite the trauma he'd endured, the pup had shown extraordinary courage and selflessness. As the fire crackled, Michael felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He'd saved Storm that day by the river, but in so many ways, Storm had saved him, too. That night, Michael sat outside under the stars, Storm lying at his feet. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers. Michael reached down, running his fingers through Storm's fur. "Life's better with you in it, buddy," he murmured. Storm let out a soft huff, his tail thumping against the porch. Michael smiled, feeling a warmth that no fire could provide, a sense of purpose, connection, and love. And as they sat together under the vast sky, Michael knew one thing for certain. The life he'd saved had, in turn, made his own life worth living. Spring had fully embraced the town, painting the landscape with vibrant greens and bursts of color. The river that had once been a place of fear and struggle now sparkled under the morning sun, its gentle flow a reminder of how far both Michael and Storm had come. Michael stood on the porch, sipping his coffee as he watched Storm chase a butterfly near the edge of the meadow. The once timid pup was now the picture of health and confidence, his sleek coat glistening and his eyes bright with curiosity. "Hey, Storm!" Michael called, setting his mug down. The dog's ears perked up, and he bounded toward Michael, his tail wagging furiously. "You ready for a big day?" Michael asked, crouching to scratch behind Storm's ears. Today wasn't just another walk or outing. Today, Michael planned to take Storm back to the riverbank where their story had begun. The path to the river felt different this time, lighter somehow. The shadows of the past no longer loomed as they had months ago. Storm trotted ahead, pausing every so often to sniff at wildflowers or chase a bird that dared to land too close. When they reached the familiar bend in the river, Michael paused, taking in the scene. The water was calm today, its surface reflecting the bright blue sky. Storm approached cautiously, his steps deliberate but steady. Michael sat on a rock by the edge, watching as Storm sniffed the air, his nose twitching with recognition. The pup looked at the river, then back at Michael, as if seeking reassurance. "You've got this, buddy," Michael said softly. Storm stepped closer, his paws sinking slightly into the soft mud. He lowered his head to the water, his reflection shimmering below. For a moment, he stood still, as if confronting the memory of that fateful day. Then, in a surprising burst of confidence, Storm leapt into the shallow water. Michael's heart swelled as he watched the dog splash and play, his fear finally replaced with joy. It was as if Storm had finally made peace with his past, embracing the river as part of his story rather than something to fear. "You did it," Michael whispered, a smile spreading across his face. That evening, as they returned home, Michael felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Storm curled up by the fire, his favorite blanket tucked beneath him. Michael sat beside him, running his fingers through the dog's soft fur. "You've taught me a lot, you know," Michael said. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. "About resilience, about second chances. I didn't know I needed saving, but you saved me just as much as I saved you." Storm let out a contented sigh, his tail thumping softly against the floor. Michael leaned back, staring into the crackling fire. For so long, his life had been defined by routine and solitude. But Storm had changed that. The little dog had brought purpose, joy, and a reminder that even the hardest battles could lead to something beautiful. A few weeks later, Michael received a letter in the mail. It was from the mother of the boy Storm had saved at the park. Enclosed was a photograph of the boy holding a hand-drawn picture of Storm, complete with a big red heart above his head. Michael chuckled as he showed the drawing to Storm. "You're famous now, buddy." Storm tilted his head, his eyes studying the paper as if he understood. The letter thanked Michael and Storm for their bravery, ending with a simple but profound statement. "Because of you, I still get to hold my son every night. Thank you for saving our family." Michael felt a lump rise in his throat as he folded the letter. He looked at Storm, who now rested his head on Michael's lap. "We make a pretty good team, don't we?" Storm wagged his tail, his amber eyes filled with the quiet trust and loyalty that had grown between them. As the seasons continued to change, so did life for Michael and Storm. The river, once a place of pain and fear, had become a symbol of their journey. Together, they had faced their fears, overcome their struggles, and built a bond that neither time nor circumstance could break. And as they sat together under the fading light of another day, Michael knew one thing for certain. The life he'd saved had not only been worth it, it had saved him in return. Storm's journey from fear to courage reminds us all that even in our darkest moments, a second chance can lead to something beautiful. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with someone who loves inspiring stories. Together, we can celebrate the bonds that make life extraordinary.